All right, here we are again. We're going to work tonight about really some time between the First and Second Crusade, because that's when things are going to get set up. But we're going to cover Crusader states. We're going to look at the Templars and the Hospitallers, and just really kind of set the stage for what happens next in the crusading world. Okay. Last time when we left off, the First Crusade had just been successful in taking Jerusalem in July of 1099. Okay, so about 4 years after the initial preaching of the Crusade, they go down, they conquer Jerusalem. Excellent, things are great. Okay, it was considered a great achievement, but that great achievement, as often is true, really set up a few extra challenges that we're going to have to face. From this point forward, the territory that I'm probably going to refer to as the Crusader states for the most part was known in Europe as Outremer. The I'm not great at French. The Crusader states. It just means the land beyond the sea. Okay, and so la mer, if you ever took French or Latin, is the sea, right? So once they have conquered Jerusalem, we're going to set up really four Crusader states. Okay, you have the Kingdom of Jerusalem down here. You have the County of Tripoli. You notice how narrow and tiny it is. You have the Principality of Antioch, and you have the County of Edessa. This is not Crusader state. This is Byzantium. All of this green and all of this green is Islamic territory, as is this green, just a different kind, as is the orange, just a different kind. Now, I find, and it's probably kind of silly, but it helps me remember, if you want to try and remember the order, because we're going to talk about placement a lot, okay, so it'll be helpful if you know where these guys are. If you remember that it is Edessa, Antioch, Tripoli, Jerusalem, you can just remember Edessa, Antioch, Tripoli, Jerusalem. Eat Jerusalem. If you eat Jerusalem, you'll make your way down the Crusader states without a problem. Okay? The reason we're going to spend some time on the Crusader states is really everything that happens in the Eastern Crusades from this point forward is going to be related to the defense of, the reconquest of, problems that they're having. Everything comes back to these guys. And so it really becomes essential that you understand where they are and what's going on in them if you want to understand the rest of the Crusades, which I assume since you picked this class, you'd like to have at least a basic understanding of. Okay? None of them are really strong enough to stand on their own. Edessa is at least sort of wider here. It's going to cross the Tigris and the Euphrates. But if you'll notice, they are surrounded by enemies. They are, especially if you look at Tripoli in the northern parts of Jerusalem, and this is actually by 1135, note, okay, right after the conquest, you're looking more at a line probably a little bit more like this here. Okay, we don't have any of this territory down here. And in fact, several of these coastal territories are not actually conquered yet. So this is going to be the process of several battles along the way. But they're really narrow. They're really in dangerous positions. It's going to be hard to take care of them. The County of Edessa, you hopefully remember, was founded by Baldwin. Well, not founded by, freakishly inherited by Baldwin. If you recall, he left and got picked up by the leader of Edessa, who then conveniently died, and then he became the Count of Edessa. So that one's maybe a little bit sketchy, right? It is different. It is wider. These are usually no more than 100 miles. In some places, only about 25 miles from the Mediterranean in. So very, very narrow. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was established basically as soon as we conquered Jerusalem. All right. Now, the kingdom part's a little bit harder. At the conquest, it was offered to Raymond of Saint-Gall, and Raymond turned it down. He didn't feel like a secular leader should be in charge of this. But it appears he might have hoped they were going to offer it again, because they're like, okay, Raymond doesn't want it. So they offered it to a guy named Godfrey. Godfrey's like, yeah, I'll take it. But he did insist that he would only be the protector or the defender of the Holy Sepulchre. He wouldn't take the title king. But then Raymond gets mad, and that's when Raymond's going to go up and take Tripoli for himself. Or at least he's going to try and take Tripoli. He actually dies in the process of taking Tripoli before it's actually conquered. And this is at least to me, a great story. So they've not actually conquered Tripoli yet, but there's a big debate because Raymond's cousin William and his son Bertrand both believe they deserve Tripoli, and they call all the local princes, including the king of Jerusalem, well, the defender of Jerusalem, to come and weigh in on this issue of who should get Tripoli, which hasn't actually been conquered yet. And all of these great leaders come to this kind of Solomon-esque decision of, well, we'll just divide it between them. And they agree, okay, we'll take that. And then it turns out in the battle, cousin William dies. He gets hit, I think he gets hit with an arrow. I'd have to double check on that, but I'm pretty sure he gets hit with an arrow. And that leaves Bertrand with all the territory anyway. So it was moot. Although it did really prove that the king of Jerusalem had the right to weigh in on decisions like this. So I guess, tangentially it has some merit, even though it didn't substantively alter who's going to be in charge. And then, of course, up in Antioch, good old Bohemond's still there. Remember, Bohemond was a major player in the First Crusade until the end, when he took Antioch, and then refused to leave Antioch and go help with Jerusalem. So he's there as well. Now, one group we haven't really talked about yet are the Italians, specifically the Pisans and the Venetians. They have not been much of a player until this point. We saw the Genoese arrive just in time to take apart their ships, but because the Italians did not march overland, they were planning a naval engagement, it took them longer to get ready. It was more than just gathering stuff. You had to actually physically build ships. And so they're just really getting to the Holy Land by this point in time. But it's super handy because they're able to help take some of these coastal territories, bring needed supplies. But the thing about the medieval Italians is they're always going to look out for themselves. So in order to help these crusader states, they insisted on special territories in each of the waterfronts where they would dock. And in those territories, they didn't have to pay any fees, right? No one else was allowed to use that dock. They had their own mills and ovens in case somebody tried to starve them out. And so they took some pretty big privileges from the locals. And in a lot of ways, the taxes that they should have paid would have helped out these crusader states immensely. But in exchange for their men and their ships and their connection to Europe, they're going to really take what they want from the crusader states. All right? Now, what are the main problems that are going to happen? Because there's definitely going to be problems in the crusader states. You know that. We're going to have 7 more numbered crusades. You don't have 7 more crusades if there's no problems, right? So, after they come in, there's going to be a severe shortage of manpower. So what happens is they conquer Jerusalem, and a bunch of the guys that had signed up to do that figure, oh, well, I'm done. I said I was going to come here. I said I was going to go on pilgrimage. I said I would take Jerusalem. I've done that. I'm going home now. And so, yes, they've got this territory, but they kind of don't have very many men. Initially, it appears that Godfrey had maybe 300 knights total and about 2,000 foot soldiers, which is hardly enough to hold a territory like Jerusalem when you're surrounded by angry Islamic defenders. Okay. Now, the quote here around Franks is that the Franks technically usually referred to people from what we would now call France. Okay. So if you're talking about the Franks and you were living in medieval Europe, you meant the French. But the Islamic world does not see any difference between those in the Holy Roman Empire, those in England, Normans, Franks, Italians. None of that means anything to them. They all are just Franks. And since they're not crusaders anymore, the crusade's over, so I can't call them crusaders anymore. Instead of picking some long convoluted title to use, I'm just going to go with what the Islamic armies called them, and they just called them all the Franks. So we just don't have enough people, right? We do have, I don't know, probably about 100 to 150,000 people living in the Crusader states, but many of those are merchants, peasants, monks, servants. You don't have much of a defensive force in that, okay? Um, and so that's going to be challenging. The other thing that's challenging is you notice there are 4 Crusader states. There's not one Crusader state. And so even though he's the king of Jerusalem, it's not like the king of Jerusalem can just order the others around and expect them to do it. In fact, the Crusader states are sometimes going to be on opposite sides of battles against each other. They're gonna fight over who inherits what territory. Even within their territories, sometimes the vassals that you have within your territory refuse to fight, or say, "I'll be there in a week, or maybe a month, or maybe a year," and just don't show up when you call them. So not everybody has the same motivation. Not everybody's there for the good of Jerusalem. A lot of them are there. I am the Count of Tripoli. I will make sure that Tripoli is successful. Maybe that's all you care about. Okay, we saw Bohemond refuse to leave Antioch before, and so there's challenging motivations between those who are in charge, and it's not particularly clear who's in charge of the whole area. There's not. You'd think the king would be, but it's not that simple. Okay. Um, we're going to have another issue uh, because of, well, let's go back to that map. If you'll notice, here's the Principality of Antioch and the County of Edessa. This is the Byzantine Empire, but there's no land route to the Byzantine Empire that doesn't go straight through some sort of Islamic territory. Either you go around Cilicia and up into the Sultanate of Rum, or you go through Cilicia, or you got to get on a boat, which of course they don't just have rolling around everywhere. So there's not a great way to travel and get access to the Byzantines either, or really to secure help from them or anything like that. So that's a difficulty. And then you're going to have decisions about how to interact. So for the first decade after they're there, Christians are pretty harsh on the Islamic world. If they take a city, if they conquer a city, they slaughter everyone inside, or basically your choices are death or convert to Christianity. Okay, they annihilate towns. They raise the walls. Raise as in destroy, not as in raise up. So for the first decade, they treat them as you would expect Crusaders to treat them. But by about 1110, we're going to see a shift in policy. And a lot of that comes from the recognition that, if you recall, the Byzantines had had this whole time, that you have to live with these people. Empty cities make no money. Okay? You slaughter all the inhabitants, there's no one to work the town, there's no one to farm, there's no one to do your dirty work, because you don't want to, certainly. And so empty cities are useless. And a lot of Muslims would rather die than convert. And so we're going to see in 1110, the Crusaders conquer the city of Sidon. It's a coastal city. And when they conquer the city of Sidon, they are much more generous. The Sidonese are willing to surrender when they are told that they will not be slaughtered and they will not be forced to convert. They'll just have to work for a new leader. And that kind of spells a change in attitudes. Okay? They're going to be willing to allow these populations to stay. And in fact, again, as time passes, Christian rulers will make alliances with, treaties with, fight battles with Muslim rulers. Because it's not like the Islamic world is one giant conglomerate either. They've got Fatimids and Abbasids and Sunnis and Shiites and Turks and Arabs. And sometimes you can fight with an Islamic force against another Islamic force and really kind of counteract some of those use those differences of opinion for yourself. Now, of course, that's not going to be popular back in Europe. The Europeans don't have this attitude. They haven't had to kind of moderate their opinion on the Islamic world, and they don't understand how the Christian Crusader states can possibly be willing to work with the Islamic territories in this area. But it happens quite a bit. In fact, Damascus, go back, sorry. So Damascus is basically this kind of long, thin run here, the Emirate of Damascus. Way back over here is going to be Baghdad, which is going to have a huge chunk of territory this way. This is mostly desert in here. But you can imagine why the Emirate of Damascus, the Emir, might be concerned about the Caliph of Baghdad. Okay, he could easily be squeezed between Jerusalem and Baghdad, or even be seen as kind of a pathway straight through to Jerusalem. And so a lot of times what we'll find is that there is an alliance between the Christians and Damascus against the Turkish Sultan and the Caliph in Baghdad. So unexpected alliances proliferate. Now, once the crusade is over, it's not like people stop coming. I already mentioned the Italians headed that direction. There are certainly what we sometimes call third wave crusaders that head down. Some of these waited till the worst of the fighting was over, or at least the worst that they thought was over. But a lot of them have perfectly good motivations. It just took them longer to get the money together. We're talking about 1100. We're not talking decades later. We're talking, 4 years later from the start, which in this era is not that much if you have to get everything together, raise the money, travel across Europe. So they're third wave, but they're not necessarily hangers-on. It's kind of a mixed group. And they're pretty enthusiastic, though. They've heard about the conquest of Jerusalem. They're ready to come in. And they head out. A lot of them are Normans. Normans are this great group. So they were originally Vikings. I'm taking a side note, sorry. The Normans were originally Vikings who were bought off by the French. Okay, so they'd been invading France. They're given a large chunk of territory in France, in northern France, that we now call Normandy. But it was the territory of the Northman. And the great thing about the Normans is even as they begin to speak French and acclimate into French society, you never quite take that adventurous Viking spirit out of them. And so they're always willing to head out on a battle somewhere. And so the Normans are a big part of this endeavor to come in on the crusade. And they head out. They're not terribly well organized. And they're going to hit Constantinople. And pretty much what you probably expect at this point in time is going to happen there. So they hit Constantinople, and what happens? Well, they're outside the city walls, they're looting, they're pillaging, they're fighting the Byzantine Emperor's troops. He gets mad, he cuts off their food supplies, they get mad, and finally he agrees to ship them on over to Asia Minor just to get rid of them. So, pretty similar story to what we've heard before. They believe that they're just going to march through easily. This is going to be a piece of cake. Well, one of the things that the Crusaders that the Franks that live there are actually hoping is that as they come through, they will conquer enough territory to give an actual direct path to Byzantium, a safe route to Byzantium. And so they want them to stay and fight in Asia Minor. And not exactly like this, but basically give a nice roadway into either Edessa or Antioch or both that's safe. I mean, if you could push the Turks out of Rome entirely, that'd be fabulous, but at least a nice pathway there. But they don't want to do this. They refuse to go with that plan. So Bohemund, our good friend, had actually been captured by the Muslims in the same year, in 1100, and as a Norman himself, they were insistent that the main thrust of their activities, first and foremost, had to be to rescue Bohemund from his Islamic captors. Okay? It's crazy. He didn't make it all the way to Jerusalem. He refused to go any further. But back in Europe, he's really kind of the poster boy of the Crusades. If teenagers had things up on their walls, girls would have Bohemund's poster up on their walls. Because he kind of gets this legendary quality. And he did have some great moments. We saw some great moments. But you would think the whole, I'm not going to go to Jerusalem part would have lost him some popularity. But it didn't. He'll actually marry the King of France's daughter eventually. So, highly popular guy. So they plan to go rescue him. Now, unfortunately, as they cross into Asia Minor, as we have seen before with ill-prepared crusading efforts, they run out of supplies. They don't know the pathway to go. They're not prepared to fight in the heat, in their armor, and with their big horses. And the Turks slaughter them. They are completely decimated. A few make it out, but very few. It's a bitter disappointment, especially for really the Crusader states. They were hoping for a lot of assistance. What they really wanted were a couple of key things. So down here, you see the city Ascalon? Okay. The Kingdom of Jerusalem really wanted to take Ascalon, because if you got Ascalon, you kind of got this whole territory around it as well. But this is a critical port. Okay? Basically, you've got a pretty significant Fatimid group in Egypt, right? And most of the time, they actually come up and they land at Ascalon, and then they come in and attack. So if you could take Ascalon, you could basically put the Sinai Desert between you and them. That would be a good thing. Or, frankly, if they could take Aleppo, okay, if they could have helped with the taking of Aleppo right here, well, that would get rid of this weird little almost wedge in between Edessa and Antioch. Or even better, if they could help conquer Damascus, well, then we could get all the way to the desert and not have a group of Islamic, sometimes enemies, right on the border of the Kingdom of Jerusalem and parts of Tripoli. Any of those things would have been great. They would have taken any of it. But they get none of it because these guys get captured, killed, die of thirst, all the things that happen when you're not prepared. Now, Bohemond will be ransomed, okay? Actually, Edessa ransoms him, surprising enough. So the Count of Edessa is going to ransom the Prince of Antioch. And you're like, well, that doesn't seem surprising. Wait till you meet these guys along the way. It's unusual for the Crusader states to help each other. He's going to leave his nephew. We met Tancred, right? He's going to leave his nephew Tancred in Antioch, and Bohemond's actually going to go back to Europe. This is when he's going to marry the King of France's daughter. But he's going to try and convince the Pope, while he's there, that there needs to be another crusade. But this one actually needs to be designed to conquer the Byzantine Empire. Right? Now, why? Why on earth? Well, do you remember when Bohemond took Antioch? He was supposed to give it back to the Byzantines if they came and asked for it. And he doesn't want to do that, and he doesn't want that hanging over his head. So he convinces the Pope at the time, a guy named Paschal II, that if they conquer Byzantium, it will heal the schism between Eastern and Western Christianity, and the Pope can be leader of all. And the Pope likes that idea. So he approves the endeavor. Bohemond raises troops, heads out, and is roundly defeated. So badly defeated outside of Byzantium that he never goes back to Antioch. He goes home humiliated and dies like a couple years later, back in Europe. And Tancred just stays down. Tancred feels like he doesn't have to honor the agreements that were made with Antioch and Byzantium, and he has no intention of doing so. But the great and magical, wonderful Bohemond falls to his own pride. He never did defeat Byzantium. Tried it for 30 years, tries it again, never takes. So what does the Islamic world feel about all this? It's a little bit harder to get sources, especially this early, from the Islamic world. And not because of translational issues, and not because of anything like that, but because they didn't write all that much. Turns out that after the First Crusade, the Islamic world didn't think too much of the First Crusade. While it's a huge deal in Western Europe, and it's just this seminal moment in European history, to the Islamic world, it was like, okay. It was a battle. We lost it. We'll come in and take it. They just don't write about it much. It seems to have been pretty much off their radar. It shows up in chronicles. They certainly know it happened, but they don't make a big deal about it. They don't write single volume novels about it like Western Europe does. There is one writer, a guy named Ali al-Salami, who writes a book called The Book of the Holy War, sometimes translates the Book of Jihad, which is always weird. I don't know if you've ever noticed, but sometimes when we do translate it like that, we know what jihad means. We've translated the words the book of, but then we leave the Islamic word jihad. So entirely in English, it's the Book of the Holy War. And he really sees the First Crusade not as this colonizing effort by the Europeans, not as this move for Christianity against Islam, but he sees it in a very Old Testament sense. This is Islam's punishment. The Crusaders exist The Western Europeans exist, and the Eastern Europeans too, exist solely as a punishment for Islam being divided and fighting amongst itself, and not following Quranic rules as they ought to. So this is their punishment piece. It has nothing to do with Western Europe. It's all about them needing to come back and repent for the things that they've done wrong. Okay? So very different attitude on that side. There are going to be a few others who do call for a jihad against specifically Jerusalem, although some of the other territories as well. But these are mostly the refugees from people from the places that the Crusaders have taken over. They've been shoved out of their homes, and they would like to institute a jihad to go back and take those places, as you can well imagine. The other thing that we're going to see from an Islamic point of view is that their attitude towards pilgrims has not changed at all. One of the things that kind of pushed off the first crusade was the fact that Christian pilgrims didn't feel safe getting to Jerusalem anymore. They were blocked a lot. And we're still having problems with pilgrims. The borders of the Crusader states are really porous. They're not well defended. And so pilgrims who set out from Europe thinking, hey, Christians rule in the Crusader states now, I'll be able, in Outremer, I'll be able to go down and visit the sites in safety, find that it is entirely not true. We've got multiple accounts of this where we see people recording, I guess I would say, their experiences. A guy named Sewolf talks about how the land's hilly, it's perilous, but it's perilous mostly because Muslims, Saracens, that word Saracens is another word for the Islamics, okay? The Muslims there. So the Saracens are constantly devising traps, and they hide, and they jump out at you, and they pounce upon you. Sorry, we've got a little bit of Middle English here. Because your numbers are so low, or if you kind of fall behind everybody else, they're all around you, and then they're gone. And there's dead bodies all along the way. Well, that's part of the problem, is that by the time a straggler, a survivor, makes it into, say, Jerusalem and tells the king that they've been attacked by the Muslims, and the king gets the troops ready and goes out there, they're gone. They've just gone back into, say, Damascus or something like that. And it's not just small groups. There's a group of 700 pilgrims that comes in, and over half of them are killed, the other half are enslaved. And again, there's no chance for retaliation. It's not possible to get there in time before the Muslims cross back into their own territories.